Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Flint. We are an inclusive, progressive, LGBTQ plus affirming church, and we're happy to have you with us. Today's service will be a video presentation brought to us by our friends from Community UU in Brighton, Living Through the Holocaust with Frank Kelemen. Our two congregations continue to find ways to work together, including sharing Sunday services. Reverend Lynn and Jerry will be back in the pulpit next Sunday. If you'd like more information about Unitarian Universalism or our congregation, feel free to contact one of our ministers, the church office. The contact information can be found at uuflint.org. Few announcements. As always, you'll find more details about announcements in your weekly e-update. Thank you to those who helped stamp and addressed 400 postcards to people who are incarcerated in Michigan, 400, urging them to vote. A special thank you to Sandra Murphy, who was a task leader on this project. What a great idea. Reminds me of Desmond Meade, who led the charge to adopt a constitutional amendment to re-enfranchise Floridians with felonies, one of the largest expansion of voting rights in the last half century. His book, Let My People Vote, and he was one of our GA speakers. I had the pleasure to listen to him online. If you had to answer two questions, what do I love about Unitarian Universalism, and what don't I love about it? To question is divine, quote, and you can help us make that service a success by answering those two questions on paper and putting them into the box out in the narthex. You can even do it anonymously if you like, or if not, just send them to Jerry by email. Jerry, Lynn, and you, our congregants, will hear and answer the questions about or concerns about Unitarian Universalism. And it's now official. We're having a big Thanksgiving Day meal here at church. Bring your family, friends, take a break from cooking. The turkey, the stuffing will be done by our longtime Thanksgiving chef, Stephanie Morales, and we hope you can bring your favorite potluck dish as well. Sign-up sheets, again, are out in the narthex. Our final announcement. Please remember, we will have a short but important congregational meeting next week after the service. We need to make final decisions about building of the ramp up to the chancel, and the board will present clearly defined options to vote on. We're going to now our time for generosity. We know that your financial contributions to this congregation come from sacrifice and hard work. We're so grateful for this and commit together to ensure the funds we gather collectively do a greater good for our church and our world than we can do alone. May there be an offering to sustain and grow the life and mission of this congregation. May we give in love and in hope. We invite you to join us as we take the collection by placing our offering in the basket at the back of church as you leave, or by an online gift at uuflint.org. All gifts are gratefully accepted. We'll now light our chalice. From the bottom of my very existence, I am pervaded with light energy, shining colors to my eye, warmth to my skin, inspiration to my soul. In this unity of creative sparks and sparkling creation, life unfolds. Let us open our senses to the light within and around us and send it out with shining examples into the world. Dorothea Kaufman. And please join me now in reciting our covenant together. Recognizing the richness of diversity, the beauty and wonder of shared worship, and the transforming power of love and service, we gather as a sacred, intentional community to freely seek knowledge and truth, to celebrate the fullness of life, and by our actions to increase goodness and justice.
Recording in progress.
We now present the UU Brighton Sunday morning service.
Thank you, Ji-hyun. Good morning. Our in-gathering song will be number 214, sung by Diane Morgan and played by Ji-hyun. Thank you, Diane. We come to you with gratitude and respect from the land of the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, and the Wyandot First Nations. Ceded to the federal government in the Treaty of Detroit, 1807. Welcome, good morning. Welcome to the Community Unitarian Universalists in Brighton, CUB for short. My name is Lee Anzik, and I will be your worship associate for today's service. Our Zoom host is Mike Kelly. Our AV tech is Joni Grobe. Providing music today is Ji-hyun, and leading us in song is Diane Morgan. Our message today will come from Frank Kelemen, retired director of counseling services at Albion College. Frank will be sharing a story of the trauma his family suffered during the Holocaust. It will be interactive and include photos and actual objects brought back to America by his parents. The message is one of hope and purpose overcoming evil. And I want to say, Frank has an actual presentation that will take place after the service. We promise to be done before noon. His message during the service will be very brief, and we'll go directly from the service into Frank's presentation. At any point, feel free to get up and leave the room. If you can't stay for the whole presentation, we understand. Don't feel self-conscious about getting up and leaving when you need to leave. Any questions about that? Is that clear? Okay. We'll try to keep things running smoothly today, but if there are problems, please blame me. I struggle so much to put these things together, and without the help of Mike and Sue and Joni, it would be a real mess up here. So we are a welcoming congregation. All are invited to worship with us, regardless of who you are, where you are from, why you are here, what you believe, or who you love. In this congregation, we believe that every person is sacred, and we are all connected. We welcome all of you to our service, especially those of you who are searching for a spiritual home. You can learn of the many opportunities to be involved in the life of CUB by subscribing to CUB's news email and from our website at cub.org. The information on how to subscribe is there as well. I have an announcement, and that is Katie Fox. Is Katie in the room? Katie's right here. Okay. Katie's generously hosting our next Kindred Spirits event on October 19th from 6 to 9 p.m. here at Cub. She will be showing us how to make beautiful dream catchers. And incidentally, that's what the kids are doing downstairs this morning. So it's a real special presentation downstairs. Please bring doilies, beads, feathers, and embroidery hoops or dream catcher rings with you. Katie will have a few rings for purchase. She will also supply cords, ribbons, and instructions. Don't miss this fun opportunity. I've made dream catchers before, and it's quite an experience. So I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Let's see. Oh, Janet Joseph said to me this morning, she reminded me that the purpose of a dream catcher is to allow good dreams to come into your space, but to stop the bad dreams. And that's what's meant by a dream catcher. So we have one in our home, and I strongly encourage you, if you've never had one or seen one, show up for Katie's workshop. It'll be worth it. Ji-Hyun? You play so beautifully. Thank you, Ji-Hyun. Come into this place of peace and let its silence heal your spirit. Come into this place of memory and let its history warm your soul. Come into this place of prophecy and power and let its vision change your heart. We light this chalice for the light of truth, for the warmth of love, and the energy of action. Our opening hymn is a video.
All right, we're going to sing Hine Matov Umanaim It's a song about how great it is to be together as a big community. Hine ma tovu manayim, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tovu manayim, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov umanayim, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov umanayim, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov, hine ma tov. Yadalai, yadalai, lai, 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 lai. Hine ma tov, hine ma tov. Yadalai, yadalai, lai, 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 lai. Hine ma tov umanayim, shevet achim gam yachad. 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 Hine ma tov, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma.
We are doing without our story of all ages today because the children have already been taken downstairs. So we're going to go straight to our offering. Let there be an offering to sustain and strengthen this congregation, which is sacred to so many of us. A community of memory and of hope, for we are now keepers of the dream. To make an online donation to Cub, please go to cub.org and click on the Donate with PayPal button under the Cub logo at the top of the page. Mindful of the offerings which are happening now and virtually, those that are ongoing, let us say together, to the work of this congregation, which is creating beloved community within and beyond our walls, we dedicate ourselves and our offerings. I'd like to share a couple of quotes from Elie Wiesel that I like, that are from his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in 1986. And that is why I swore never to be silent whenever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are in danger, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. There is much to be done. There is much that can be done. One person, Raoul Wallenberg, and Albert Schweitzer, one person of integrity can make a difference of life and death. As long as one dissident is in prison, our freedom will not be true. As long as one child is hungry, our lives will be filled with anguish and shame. What all these victims need above all is to know that they are not alone, that we are not forgetting them, that when their voices are stifled, we shall lend them ours, that while their freedom depends on ours, the quality of our freedom depends on theirs. I now invite Frank to come up to the podium and share a few words.
I'm rather soft-spoken, so can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Let me know if you can. Well, good morning. Morning. And I'd like to thank Lee and the members of the community for inviting me to speak with you about the story of my family. It's a story of love and loss, of tragedy and survival, of despair and hope, of desperate separations and times of mutual aid. You know, survivors of the Holocaust often repeat the mantra of never again as their reason for telling the stories of their experience during the war. They held on to the hope that by hearing of their trauma, people would learn the lesson that bigotry and hatred are anathema to humanity, that systematic oppression and genocide have no place in the world. But we know that human behavior is difficult to change. Cambodia, Rwanda, ethnic cleansing in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Rohingyas in Myanmar, and right now the atrocities and slaughter that's happening in Ukraine. They seem to defeat our intention of never again. 5 years ago, neo-Nazis marched through the streets of Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us." At that time, such open hatred of Jews and the idea that Jews were working to displace non-Jews were considered kind of a fringe conspiracy theory, very not well known. Today, you can hear the great replacement theory accepted as fact in some arenas and openly discussed on national television programs. According to a poll by the Southern Poverty Law Center, replacement theory has become a mainstream idea on the political right. I think it's kind of become a version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was one of the main anti-Semitic publications in the last century. And although less blatantly anti-Semitic, it still has the underlying message that Jews and Jewish conspiracy is secretly planning on plotting to control the world. All this reminds me of a statement by Goebbels that, quote, "If you tell a lie big enough and you keep on repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." You don't have to look very far or very hard to see the amount of airtime devoted on Fox News, for example, in repeating these false and disproven claims to see the similarity. And these lies fuel discontent and further inflame a significant segment of the American populace who now believe that political violence is acceptable and necessary, including threats against politicians and even assassinations. There have been an appalling number of attacks at the AME Church Prayer Group in Charleston, the Jewish Community Center in Los Angeles, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Christchurch, in the El Paso Walmart and the supermarket in Buffalo. And all of these incidents were instigated in part or wholly by the belief on the part of the perpetrators that the presence of people who we find different from us threatens our place in society. So, why tell this story? Why tell the story of what happened during the war? Today, we're lucky to have a wealth of information available about the Holocaust, their personal testimonies, video testimonies, documentaries, survivor autobiographies, movies, plays, novels, even graphic novels. They abound. But I believe that by listening to these stories, we can learn about the dangers of ultranationalism and xenophobia on national policies involving immigration, racial and gender discrimination, economic turmoil, and the allure of authoritarianism, all problems and dangers that we face today. I'm aware that these stories are not easy to hear, and they're not easy for me to share. But that you've invited me to talk with you stands against recent waves of denial and dismissal of the dehumanization and horrors of the Holocaust. I think that the sheer number of examples we see today of cruelty and hostility, and assigning hostility and otherness to certain groups of our fellow men can overwhelm us. We can sometimes be left struggling to cope with the heartbreak of so many instances of humanity that are unfortunately part of our lives every day. However, listening to these stories are listening and acknowledging to these stories are actions. And as Elie Wiesel says, as actions, we all become witnesses. And these actions begin to weave a network of understanding and of mutual acknowledgement and sharing. So once again, I thank you for inviting me to share the story with you.
Our closing hymn is a video of Peter, Paul, and Mary. And the title of the song is Light One Candle. If you'd like to follow along, it's number 221 in your gray hymnal. And I say follow along, you can sing along too.
Lee, I think you forgot Joys and Sorrows.
We've opted not to do that, Mike, in order to make sure people can stay for the whole presentation.
Okay, I'm sorry. It was in the
Thanks
script.
for the
I'm
reminder,
sorry.
appreciate it. Okay.
Light one candle for the Maccabee children, with thanks that their light didn't die. And light one candle for the pain they endured, when their right to exist was denied. Light one candle for the terrible sacrifice justice and freedom demand. Light one candle for the wisdom to know when the peacemaker's time is at hand. Don't let the light go out, it's lasted for so many years. Don't let the light go out, let it shine through our love and our tears. Light one candle for the strength that we need to never become our own foe. And light one candle for those who are suffering pain we learned so long ago. Light one candle for all we believe in, let anger not tear us apart. And light one candle to bind us together, for peace is the song in our heart. Don't let the light go out, it's lasted for so many years. Don't let the light go out, let it shine through our love and our dreams. Don't let the light go out, it's lasted for so many years. Don't let the light go out, let it shine through our love and our tears.
What is the memory that's valued so highly that we keep it light and not flame? What's the commitment to those who died to cry out they've not died in vain? We have come this far, always believing that justice will somehow prevail. This is the burden, this is the promise, this is why we will not fail. Don't let the light go out, it's lasted for so many years. Don't let the light go out, let it shine through our love and our tears. Don't let the light go out, it's lasted for so many years. Don't let the light go out, let it shine through our love and our tears. Don't let the light go out. Don't let the light go out. Don't let the light go out.
How appropriate. In deference to the song and to Frank's message, I'm going to leave the chalice lit. We'll close it, we extinguish it after Frank's messages. I want to say one other thing. Frank will be bringing out items that his parents brought back from the Holocaust, including his mother. His mother's prison uniform. when I touched that, it changed my life. So they'll be up here for anybody that wants to see them. Frank, I think I don't have anything to read here. Let's see. Yeah. Would you please come back up?
Okay. Are you able to get it? There, great. Okay. So I'll be presenting slides of the from photographs of the family history. Is that better? Okay. This over here. Okay, next slide. So the family story takes place in Poland, in Germany, and in Hungary. And the way the war unfolded was different in each place. So I think that this story highlights how it was not a unified experience across Europe. It was different. So my mother was born in the small town called Podwalachiska. And at that time, Podwalachiska was in Galicia, which is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After the First World War, it became part of Poland. And today it's in Ukraine. Next slide. And my family was there. My mother's family was there. They went there because it was a space where the gauge of the railroads changed from Russia into Western Europe. So everyone had to get off the train. They had to unload all the cargo and load it back onto new trains. And so my family settled there. They opened a hotel, as you can see. It says Hotel Weigler, and then they had a small factory where they made these small metal items. They had a grocery store. They had the first movie theater in the area. So the family settled there and was doing quite well and got well established. Next slide. This is my grandfather and my grandmother on their the wedding at the time of their wedding anniversary. Next slide. That would have been about 1900. And then here you can see at the beginning of the World War, the red and blue lines are the lines between the Germans and the Russians, and because Austro-Hungary was allied with Germany, and Russia was part of the French and English alliance. And Podwalachiska was right about down here, right on the border. So my grandfather was taken by the Russians for civilian defensive labor, so we're building trenches and things like that. And to get the family away from the war, he sent my mother, my grandmother, my mother, her sister and brother, and my great-grandmother to his brother, who at that time was living in Leipzig, Germany, which is it's east of Berlin, quite far away from the fighting. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of my grandfather when he came back after the war. He came back to Leipzig. This was 1917, so the Russians got out of the war. You know, when the communists took over, and withdrew from the war, and he was released, and he joined the family in Leipzig. Next slide. However, the myth, the ideas began right away in Germany that the Germans never were defeated, but they were stabbed in the back. And the blame for the stabbing in the back was placed upon the Jews. That the Jews used the war for profiteering, that the Jews avoided military service, which was quite untrue. Actually, the Jewish population in Germany was overrepresented in the fighting. In part, I think, because the German Jews wanted to prove that they were really citizens of Germany and not outsiders. Next slide, please. So here's a photograph of my mother and her siblings. My mom's the one with the big bow in her hair. Then her older sister Gisela, her younger sister Anita, and her older brother Ike. This was taken in about maybe 1920. Okay, next slide, please. And then this is the family that was in Leipzig. The family there, my grandfather's brother, Victor, established a thriving business in seltzer water. So these are the pictures of him, his two children and his wife, and then him and his brother and my great-great-grandfather. Next slide. And then in 1929, my father started medical school in Leipzig. That's how he met my mom. He was 19 and my mom was 16. So here they are as they first met and started dating. Next slide, please. And then this is my mother's graduation from the gymnasium, from high school. She is at the bottom. At 19, and then she started medical school at the University of Vienna, of Leipzig. This was in 1932. Next slide, please. And here's my dad in 1932. He was in his final year of his medical training. He is the second from the right. And so he was almost finished in 32. He was almost finished with his medical school. Next slide, please. And then in 1933, things started to change. In January, I believe it was, Hitler became chancellor. And this is a photograph of Hitler marching through the streets of Leipzig. One of the first things they did was they closed the universities to Jews. So my mother would have been starting her second year of medical school, but she had to drop out. She was kicked out of the medical school. Fortunately, my father finished, so he got his degree. He was able to finish his degree. And then he went on to a residency in pediatrics, but he had to leave Germany and went to Prague. Next slide, please. And as soon as Hitler took power, right away, anti-Semitic propaganda began to be present and heightened. So here you see Jews, the enticer of the war, the prolonger of the war. He's to blame for the war, and the photographs on the things usually showed, Jews as fat, kind of ugly, wealthy. I think it speaks for itself. Next slide, please. And then in 1935, my parents got married. And this is a picture of them right before their wedding. And they got married and they went to Bucharest, which is the capital of Romania. Actually, my father was born in Hungary, but after the war was over, the part of Hungary that he was born in, Transylvania, was given to the Romanians. So he was born a Hungarian, then he became a Romanian. I think it's for Americans, it's very difficult for us to imagine what it was like in Europe in those days, where the borders and the nationalities and what nationality were changed. One day you're Polish and the next day you're German and then you're Russian. And then I think it's very difficult for us since we've had such stable borders. But anyways, Mom and Dad went to Bucharest and Dad began his practice and they began their lives there. Next slide, please. However, for the rest of the family, it was a little bit different. My uncle Ike, he had come to America in 1929. He eventually went back to Europe and came back, and he settled in America, and he was living in New York and became an American citizen, married an American woman. Now, this is also when things are, by 35, the Nuremberg laws were enacted in Germany, which was the racial laws, and things for Jews were getting worse and worse. So the family dispersed. My mom was in Bucharest with my father. Ike was in New York. My mom's older sister, Gazella, she married a young man, an engineer, and they were both communists, and they went to Russia to build a better world. And they were in Moscow. However, in 1936, when Stalin began the Stalinist purges, there was a knock at the door one night, and the police came and took my uncle away, and he was never seen again. And not long after that, actually, I think it was after the war was over, so a little bit later, my aunt was denounced as a spy and sent first to prison. I believe she was probably in the Lubyanka prison in Moscow. And then she was sent to a gulag in Siberia, where she stayed until 1958, when the gulags were beginning to be liberated by Khrushchev. So she escaped the Nazis, but did not escape difficulties. And my aunt, the youngest child, my aunt Anita, she went to Palestine, where one of my grandfather's brothers had gone in the 20s. And so she escaped from Germany into Palestine and was there until, I believe, 1938 or 39, when she joined the family that made it to New York. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, were able to get out of Germany in 1935. They were very lucky. My grandfather would have been arrested because they were not German nationals, they were Polish, and non-citizen Jews that weren't citizens of Germany were arrested and usually sent to Dachau. But my grandfather heard about it. He was able to get to the American embassy, and because he had a family in America who were able to vouch for him, he was able to get a visitor's visa. So he was able to get out of Germany in 1935. So my mother's parents and her siblings all made it out of Germany. Next slide, please. At the same time, while this was going on in Germany, you know, there was what was happening to the Jews in Germany was pretty well known around the world. There was this hearing in '39 of a subcommittee in the United States to try to admit German refugee children. This was not adults, this was children up to the age of 17, like from 5 to 17. And it was completely defeated in Congress. Claims that these were going to be aliens, claims that they were going to take our jobs away, claims that they would undermine the American ethos, not unsimilar to what we hear today. Next slide, please. But in England, they had a different approach. 10,000 German children under the age of 17 were taken to Germany on the Kindertransport. Next slide, please. So some of the laws in 33, Jews are removed from civil service, from practicing law. You know, there's that economic and professional changes. 35, the racial laws and urban laws. And 38, more and more laws restricting Jews, taking away their economic livelihoods, taking away their belongings, restricting their movements, restricting their civil liberties, which by 38, there were no longer any civil liberties for Jews in Germany. Next slide. And then in November of 38 was Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when synagogues across Germany were ransacked and destroyed and burned. Jewish shops were burned. Hundreds of Jewish men were arrested. And the next day, the Jewish community was required to pay for the damage, which I don't remember the amounts, but they were blamed for the damage and required by the German government to pay for the damage. And by this time, by 38, it was too late, I think, for anyone to escape, to get out of Germany. If you hadn't gotten out at this point, you were caught. Next slide, please. So the Jewish population of Leipzig in 1933 is 11,000. Almost half left the city. They went wherever they could go. Sometimes they ended up in Western Europe, like in France or in Belgium or in Holland, where they thought they would be safe. In Kristallnacht, there's arrests, as I mentioned. And then in 42, the deportations began. And by the end of the war, there were 220 Jews left in Leipzig. Next slide, please. And the family that had originally been in Leipzig, my grandfather's brother and his family, they didn't leave, probably because they felt that they were too well established, they had too much to lose. And the ethos among much of the Jewish community was, we've been through difficult times before, we just have to hunker down and this too will pass. There really hadn't been an instance in which the outcome was the extermination of the Jews. That's not something that anyone imagined. And if they thought it, I think if they had those thoughts, they wouldn't have believed it, that it was possible. So my father's brother and his family and his children and his grandchildren were all killed. I don't have the exact data of what happened to them, but they either were deported and died in one of the ghettos from starvation or malnutrition, or they were killed probably in one of the extermination camps. So that part of the family did not make it. Now, back to Poland. There was still family in Poland on my mother's side. Next slide, please. And here you see a photograph. That's the other thing that gets confusing is my parents would talk about this. They would say, no, they would talk about Lvov, Lviv, Lemberg. These are all the same cities, but they have the different name depending on what country it is. So Lviv is Ukrainian, Lvov is Polish, Lemberg is Galician. But this is a picture of the family in 1938 before the war. And the very sort of fuzzy guy on the bottom there, that's my great-great-grandfather. And on the end here is my great-great-grandmother and some of the family members that were still in Poland because my grandmother's family remained in Poland. My maternal grandmother's family remained in Poland. Next slide, please. And then here's some other cousins of hers and uncles, her Uncle George and her Uncle Sigmund, who also stayed in Poland. Next slide, please. So in Poland, it was different. In Germany, you know, it started in 1933, and there was a little bit of a gradual movement of anti-Semitic laws in that. I'm back? Okay. So in October 1939, when the Germans invaded, already there was forced labor, synagogues destroyed, quickly Jewish assets frozen, the requirement to wear the yellow star, travel restrictions. By April 1940, within less than a year, the first ghetto was built in Lodz. And by 1942, most of the ghettos are established, and all of the extermination camps, the 5 major extermination camps had been built of Auschwitz, Auschwitz, Majdanek, Chelmo, Sobibor, and Treblinka. So by the middle of 1942, the extermination camps were established, and the use of these camps was underway. Prior to the 1942, as the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe and Lithuania, in that area, the extermination was taking place by shooting squads. They talk about that as the Holocaust by bullets, where people were taken into the forest and shot. There's a Catholic priest, I forget his name, who recently has been going there and finding the sites and digging up the bullets in the field. There's still thousands of bullets left in the field where this took place. But in 1942, the Nazis decided that this was too hard for the soldiers. It was taking too much time, and it was too difficult for the soldiers. So they established the use of the extermination camps, first with carbon monoxide poisoning and then with Zyklon B. Next slide, please. And this is just a map of Lodz, in which you can see the ghetto in orange and then the labor camp in red. And so Jews were used as slave labor as long as they were able to work. And if you were not able to work, you were exterminated and sent to one of the extermination camps. And so I believe that this is where the family ended up. And of the family in Poland, there were no survivors. Next slide, please. And this is just a photograph of Jews in Lodz being marched through the streets as people watched. Next slide, please. And so here you see then the sites of the major extermination places and camps throughout Poland. And there, these were in Poland because the largest number of Jews in Europe were in Poland. There were about over 3 million Jews in Poland. So that's made sense that that's where they established the extermination camps, just for a matter of efficiency. And they were very efficient. Next slide, please. And then Hungary. As I said, my father was born in Hungary, in Transylvania. Next slide, please. And here's my paternal grandparents, Alexander and Esther Kelemen, and this is their engagement photograph, probably in 1907. Next slide, please. Then here's a photograph of my grandmother and my father, and my grandmother and my father and his sister. My dad was born in 1910. Next slide, please. And this was my grandfather. He was a captain in the Imperial Guard of the Austro-Hungarian Army, so that in 1914 he went to war to fight with the Austro-Hungarians, primarily on the Russian front, on the Russian border. Next slide, please. And then here's some photographs of my grandpa back from the war on leave in 1914, and I think the bottom photograph is 1915. Soon after this photograph was taken, he was captured by the Russians and sent to Siberia to a prisoner of war camp. And even though the Russians got out of the war in 1917, they did not release the captured prisoners. So he was in a prison camp in Siberia until 1920, at which time he escaped with 3 other men, and they crossed Siberia and eventually made their way to Sweden, who then the Swedes repatriated them to Hungary. So he was gone from pretty much from 1914 until 1921, when he finally made it back after the war. Next slide, please. And so here's one part. This is my grandmother's, my paternal grandmother's side of the family, the Kieselstein family. And this is their 50th wedding anniversary. The fellow in the middle with the white mustache and beard, that's my great-grandfather Mendel and his wife Rosa, and it's their 50th wedding anniversary. And next to Rosa is my great-great-grandfather Abraham Leibowitz, and then the rest of the family, aunts and uncles and cousins. And on the left-hand side, the last man, that's my grandfather. Sitting below him is my grandmother, and standing next to him is my father. And then sitting on my great-grandfather's lap is my Aunt Nushi, his sister. You can see the family is, I like this photograph because it shows the change across time. My great-great-grandfather, who is dressed traditionally more Orthodox, and my great-grandfather a little bit less. And by the time it's to my grandfather and my father, they're pretty much assimilated and wearing the clothing you would expect anybody to be wearing. So it shows sort of the change in Orthodoxy over time. And the family was doing well. They're happy and prosperous. The war was over. They were able to reestablish themselves. Next slide, please. And again, photograph of mom and dad. They were well established in Bucharest. Next slide, please. My dad had his pediatric practice, and these are just some photographs that somehow, I don't know where they came from, but somehow were saved of Dad and as he was starting his practice. My mom began as a German tutor, because at this time, Germany's and the German economy was becoming very strong. So people wanted to do business in Germany. So the Romanians and the Romanian populace wanted to learn German. So my mother started a tutor in German. And that's how the family kind of survived. Go ahead. Next slide, please. Now the quotas this time, you can see some of the numbers. My mom was able to get a quota because her parents were in America and her brother was in America, and she had a sponsor that would sponsor. You had to sponsor someone so that they had money that the person would not become a burden on the American society. So she had a sponsorship, and she also had the number from Germany, so she was able to get a visa. But my dad from Romania, you can see the total number of people allowed in Romania was 377. So he was not able to get a visa. So rather than leave him, Mom decided to stay in Romania with him and wait until he was able to get a visa to come. And again, this is 1938. The war hasn't begun yet. Next slide, please. And so as the war began in 1939, here is again the photograph, and you can see that my great-grandmother and my great-great-grandfather had passed away from natural causes, from illness. But the rest of the family is there and okay. Next slide, please. So just go to the history here. In the 1930s, there were approximately 800,000 Jews in Hungary. By 38, the restrictions against Jews were primarily economic. they were cut out of the professions, they were cut out of jobs, they were cut out of sort of the economic life of the community. There was restrictions on food, there was restrictions on travel. They had to wear the yellow star. There were fines, property confiscations. There were racial laws passed, but there was not the same kind of brutality and arrests and things that were going on in Germany and Hungary at this time. Also, there was a, next slide, please. Then in September 1942, my brother was born. And at this point also, I should say that my parents left Bucharest and went back to Hungary. There was a rule in Hungary that if you could prove that your family had lived in Hungary, I don't remember for how many years, you were exempt from some of the deportations and some of the difficulties. And my family had papers going back to the early 1700s that they had been living in Transylvania. So my father and mother believed they would be safer in Transylvania. So they went back to Turga Mureș, where my father's family was. And then in September 1942, my brother Jerry was born. And here they are with a picture of Jerry. Next slide, please. So in 41 to 44, Jews were deported from Hungary, but only Jews who were not Hungarian citizens. So Jews had escaped from Poland into Hungary, were then deported back to Poland. Some Jews were taken for forced labor battalions where they would have to be on the front and dig trenches or go through minefields, defusing mines. So, as I said, my dad went back to Transylvania, and since many of the doctors, the Hungarian doctors, were drafted into the army, and my dad was a doctor, they needed doctors, so they sent him to a small town, I think it was called Ojdola, and where he was like the county doctor. But one of the things he was able to do, my mom stayed with his parents in Turga Mureș and eventually joined him. But one of the things he was able to do, he was able to get a typhus vaccine, and he was able to vaccinate my mom and himself, which later, I'm sure, helped them survive the war. So things were getting difficult for Jews in Hungary, but it was very difficult, very different. There were no ghettos in Hungary at this time until 1944. There were really not massive deportations or shootings. So they felt safe enough that they would be able to survive. Next slide, please. And then in 1944, things changed very rapidly. That's when Adolf Eichmann went to Hungary. And even though the war at this point was clearly lost, the Nazis were determined to eradicate the last large population of Jews in Europe, the Hungarian Jews. And so starting in March, the Hungarian government also saw that the war was being lost, and they began to make overtures to the Allies to surrender. And the Germans found out about this. So in March of 1944, the Germans occupied Hungary and established a much stronger Hungarian Nazi, the Iron Cross, they were called, a Nazi regime in the Hungarian government. And as I said, the de-Jewification of Hungary began. Next slide, please. So in April, they begin to establish ghettos. Again, as I mentioned, there had not been ghettos in Hungary, anything that had gone on in Poland, in some of the other countries. None of that had been going on. But in May, in April, they start to establish ghettos. In May, they start deportations. And in between May 15th and July 9th, approximately 500,000 Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. There was also an order that 100,000 were to be selected for slave labor and sent back to Germany. So they go through the selections, and fortunately my parents were able to survive that. I'd like to read you something from my father's journal. This is something how they survived and what happened when they arrived in Birkenau. They never told my sister and I until we were quite a bit older. But Yep. Closer? Okay. So according to the Red Cross documents, we arrived in Birkenau on June 5th, 1944. Hani, it's my mother, got down from the train first from the cattle car on the ramp, and I stayed in the corner trying to find out from the prisoner in a striped suit, what is going on? What is this place? Where are we? What is happening? There was screaming, yelling, dogs barking. The man told me, "Is that your wife and child? Don't let her hold the child." I got down to where the SS was separating the men and the women into two ramps. I don't really know why or what, but I did what he said, and you children know the rest. And then we were separated, and I no longer saw what happened, and I never saw my Jurika again. It is the most terrible for me to picture this and imagine what happened to Jurika. Was he with a nanny, or did he die alone? Who held him? This is before my eyes every day. Somehow it comes back every night, lying in bed, with the question of why. Why did he have to go to his death without us, to die alone? Was it a better alternative to let Hani go and die with him? In those terrible few moments, I chose life. I chose to survive and to live, but I have to live with it. This is our share, is to live with the memory of what happened. It's with me the same way every day. The family survives and prospers. Our survival brought this about, yet the pain and sorrow of Jurika's loss, the loss of my parents and family, remains forever. Next slide, please. So this is just a photograph of the Hungarian Jews being deported. There were a series of photographs found after the war taken by a Nazi soldier. You know, there were no photographing in the camps was not allowed. But for some reason, there was a Nazi soldier who took a whole series of photographs. So most of the photographs you see of Birkenau were of the Hungarian Jews arriving in 44. And the photographs and the negatives were hidden, and they were found kind of buried in one of the barracks after the war was over. And no one, I don't think they know who took them or why, but this is the only real record we have of what went on. Next. And so here you see the men and women being separated on the ramp in Birkenau. They arrived approximately 10,000 a day in Birkenau. And you see the women on the left, the men on the right, and one of the Nazi officers is Mengele, who would look at you and point left to right, death or not. Next slide, please. And here you see a picture of my mom. Looking away. I believe this picture was taken. Mom was sent to Plaszów after she survived the selection. She was sent to Plaszów, which was a concentration camp outside of Krakow. And that's the camp, if you saw Schindler's List, that's the camp of Plaszów. And then when that camp was evacuated, as the Russians were approaching, she was sent back to Birkenau, where she went through a second selection, which she survived again. And I believe that this photograph was taken at that time during the second selection. She was then sent to a concentration camp in Germany at a place called Markkleeberg. And Markkleeberg was right outside of Leipzig, where she grew up, and it's a place where she used to go and swim with her friends in the summer. So she said that when she knew where she was and she was in Germany, she knew that she would survive. Somehow she would figure out a way to survive because she was German speaking. Next slide, please. This is just the crematorium in Birkenau, which the Nazis destroyed, tried to destroy evidence of what had been going on. Next slide, please. And this is just a photograph of the women and prisoners working in Birkenau. Next slide, please. And this is the camp of Kaufering, where my father was sent. Kaufering was a sub-camp of Dachau, and it was a place where they were building, I think it was connected to a Messerschmitt jet factory. And this photograph was taken after the war by the American Army, and you could see the triangular things were sort of underground barracks where the prisoners were kept, And you can see how many of them were burned down since before they evacuated the camp, they locked prisoners into the barracks and burned them down. Those who were able to walk were marched out. The Nazis had a plan that they would march prisoners into the Alps, into the Bavarian Alps, where they would build fortifications and sue for a better peace. Next slide, please. And this is a photograph that were taken of the march out of Dachau, which my dad was on. You can see the prisoners march. There were about 3,000 prisoners on the march. 5 days later, there were about less than 1,000 left alive. Dad said that they marched them into a ravine and surrounded them with machine guns and told them that they will all be dead in the morning. But when they woke up in the morning, the German soldiers were gone. And as they climbed out of the ravine, they saw American jeeps coming and American troops, actually members of the Nisei Brigade, of the Japanese-American Nisei Brigade, and they were liberated. Next slide, please. And so this is a letter that my father sent to my grandparents in New York through the American Army. After a year of slavery, the glorious American Army liberated me from the hand of our murderers in Dachau. Have you news from Jana? I hope she's in life. We were separated a year before. And he gives my address. Next slide, please. And hopes for a telegram from them if they have any word if she's alive. Next slide, please. This is an interesting story. This is a letter that was written by an English soldier to my grandparents in New York. My mom was also on a march out of Markkleeberg, and she and 3 other women escaped from the march and hid in the woods. And while they were hiding, they came across 3 British prisoners of war who all had also escaped. This was late April of 1944. And so Mom said that she was going to go into the nearest town and try to get them food. She would somehow bring food back. And so she went into the town. She found that some people. She told them who she was, that she was a Jewish prisoner, and that she had British soldiers hiding with her, and that if they would help, the British soldiers would give affidavits that they had been helped by the people to the Americans and the British armies that were coming. So for the next 2 weeks, she would go back and forth between the town and the place in the forest where the soldiers were hiding and bring medical supplies and food and things like that. And the fighting was still going on. It's not like the war ended and all of a sudden the fighting stopped. The fighting continued and continued. So she was a pretty tough cookie. But this is the letter that was sent by one of the British soldiers to my grandparents in New York, talking about what she had done and trying to help her. And through the British, she eventually made it to the Americans, and the Americans helped her find my father, and then they were reunited in a place called Bad Nauheim, where my mother was working as a translator with the Americans. The love my parents had for the American soldiers just was unbelievable. My mom, when they would talk about the American boys, they just described these young boys and why were they here? Why were they fighting and risking their lives for us? And my mom told a story what it was like after. My dad said, when he was liberated, and there was an American colonel who was asking him, "What do you need?" And he said he called me sir. And he said, could you imagine that? Here I am, a person, I have nothing. I have no country, I have no papers, I'm displaced. And this colonel, an officer, calls me sir, asks me what I need, and I tell him we need everything. And the next day, truckloads of supplies arrive, and they established a hospital to take care of the prisoners. Mom said she was working for the American Army, and she was still considered a German national. So she wasn't allowed to fraternize with the American soldiers. So where they were having their meals, she was supposed to sit with the German employees, but she said she wouldn't do that. So the officer said, okay, they set up for her a table in a room by herself that was divided with a partition from the American soldiers. So she sat down to eat, and all of a sudden the partition opened up, and she said all of all of the Americans just came to join her, said, you can't eat with us, but we will eat with you. And that was their introduction to America. And they said, what kind of a place is this, that people treat us like that? Next slide, please. So here's a picture again of the family before the war. And then, next slide. And here's a picture who was still alive in 1945. And as you can see, it's all the young people. Everyone else had been killed. All together, on my mother's side and my father's side, there's over 90 or 100 members of the family were killed. On my father's side, his sister and a couple of cousins survived, but everyone else was murdered. And on my mother's side, luckily, as a child of survivors, most children of survivors have no grandparents. Don't know what but I was lucky because my mother's parents got out, so I had grandparents. But you can see the devastation of the family. Next slide, please. And then in 1946, my parents made it on the first boat of displaced persons to the United States on the Marine Flasher. This is a photograph of them on their way. Next slide, please. And so the family, next slide. Here you can see my dad, his cousins, his sister, and another cousin. Next slide. And here he is sitting with a white mustache with my mom and myself and my wife and the family. And in back of him, in back of my mom is my aunt, his sister, and in the corner is the one cousin who had survived also. Next slide, please. And again, you see the little baby in the corner. Next slide, please. This is him with his wife and his children and grandchildren. So the family continued and survived and went on. And I like to say that when my parents came to America, there were just the two of them. And then they had my sister and I. And then my sister and I had our children. And then our children had their children. So there's about 19 of us now out of the two that first came. So So, why listen? What's the lesson of the Holocaust? What's this all about? I do this to remember the family that was lost, to keep the memories alive. Elie Wiesel said that one answer was that humanity is hopeless, that we might as well give in to pessimism and despair. However, he thought that was really not the appropriate response. He offered a better possibility, a different one. That we maintain faith in man and maintain faith and hope in the face of these instances of cruelty, hatred, and evil. So listening to the testimonies of survivors, one thing is clear. Survivors never gave up, despite the bigotry, the hatred, despite Treblinka, Chelmo, Majdanek, Sobibor, Bežic, Auschwitz, Birkenau. They never gave in to despair. There's questions of why didn't they fight back? Why did they go like sheep to the gas chambers? They didn't. They fought. They survived. They could have, given up and died, but even in those places, they didn't give up hope. They went on to build their families and to dream of a future. My parents were as patriotic as any Mayflower descendants. They loved America, and they were grateful for being able to live in this country. And I've had a long and secure career. My wife has had a secure career, well, a psychologist, and my children have grown to be psychologists and a cardiologist. And so in a ways, our family exemplifies the American dream that my parents believed in and that we all wish was a possibility for everyone. Yet despite this, my mother would ask me, she would say, Frankie, does anyone know Auschwitz? Does anyone know what happened to the Jews? She wanted to know that people cared, that it hadn't just been forgotten. And over the years, with many reassurances, and she also gave a testimony to the Shoah Foundation, she came to believe that people did care what had happened. that the war was not just being forgotten. And yet, despite my reassurances to her that people do care, I recognize that within myself, there is fear of anti-Semitism. It lingers, it stays with us. I recently asked my daughter, who moved to a new community, does she want to put a mezuzah on her door? Does she want to identify her family and her house as being Jewish? But over time, I've come to understand that these anxieties, which I carry with me, can lead me to turn inward and away from others and away from the larger community. But instead, I want to use these worries beyond my day-to-day decisions as an American Jew and help lead me to a life of compassion, of service to others, and to connection with other groups and their sufferings. Jews are not the only group at risk as the global social unrest and insecurity grows. And there's many who meet the world each day with the worries and risks about their lives and what their children will face in the future. While my own concerns about anti-Semitism might lead me to retreat and turn away from the larger community, I have to instead reach out and partner with others and connect with others. And so beyond the healing of any one survivor or any one survivor's child, knowing that we here as a community, and you invite me to speak, care about these stories, feel compassion, also alarm and outrage, and the need to stand as witnesses when we recognize inhumanity, racism, anti-Semitism, atrocities, genocidal attacks. We can speak out, and sometimes we can find even a way to take action. And I think that I very much believe what Elie Wiesel said, by listening, we become witnesses, and by witnesses, we can speak out, and that silence is the enemy. So even if we can't do anything, we can speak out. So once again, thank you for inviting me. And I hope that, not that you enjoyed it, but that found this helpful and meaningful. Thank you. And I do have some things here that this was part of her newsletter. When she left Auschwitz the second time, I went back to
Frank, I'm going to take this microphone so people online can hear you.
When she left after the second selection, the officer who was telling her to volunteer to go to this new camp told her it's good.
Thank you. Thank you for attending today's first shared Sunday service with Community UU in Brighton. And remember, we're challenged to never forget to remember many of us had parents of the World War II generation. And we are witnesses also to these times. Let us love, learn about others in synagogues, mosques, in churches, on the streets with the Black community, and together with our gay and transgender friends. Let us speak our truth, work for justice, be the light. And now we will extinguish our chalice. Thank you. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.